Chapter 8. From Whence It Came. The lifetime that last saw the Jabberwock king sat here, on the cusp of war, had rapidly become history. He wondered, with more intrigue than concern, if he still had the nerve to take a life. He thought his powers might make it easier. Maybe his new immortality would take away the necessity of killing, and leave him only with a taste for it. The anger inside said it would. This introspection made the battle cries of his horde into a sweet serenade. As they spilled from their cliffside caves and took to the air, he readied himself for the playground. A mixture of magic and deformation gave him wings. Now, some would call them the wings of an angel fallen from on high, whereas others would say they were the wings of a carrion bird who adores the end results on a battlefield. Either way, they were glorious, beautiful. He'd grown accustomed to the pain caused by shape-shifting, maintaining that it was never anything compared to that which he had, and was about to cause again. As Icarus, with toes curled around the edge of his plateau, he cast himself off, free-falling until taking flight. Your Highnesses, we've sounded our alarm to warn Wonderland, and the men have taken their positions, awaiting your orders. An officer relayed, entering the throne room of the Black Royalty unannounced. The information was received by an apparently bored, unengaged, and sleepy King of Clubs, who replied, "Ah, Lieutenant, I do so loathe having to be the one to bring this news after you've clearly expended your energy coming to us. But you may tell them to stand down." "Stand down, my lord." He staggered inadvertently. "Yes, as in do not engage the Horned King or his Jabberwockies," Club defined, barely enthused enough to remove his head from against his wrist. "That's understood, sire, but if we don't take action right now, we discard our advantage, our best chance to land the first blow," he opinionized, ever mindful of the strategies in place. "Exactly, Sir Knight, because it's not needed," Club expressed with a shrug-adjacent hand gesture. "Not needed?" the knight dared again, letting his passion overshadow his formalities. "King Diamond is depending on us to do something, not just sit idly by, pardoning the full brunt of our enemy's force to go, freely invading our lands." "Oh, I like this one," the king exclaimed to his wife while teetering on his armrest. "He's got a fire in him. Smart, too. But is it too much so, or not quite enough?" he bantered until re-involving the officer. "But I wouldn't feel good sending you back out there until knowing for certain that we have a mutual understanding of what's happening here. What was the order I gave you?" "To stand down, sir," the soldier answered, piping himself down. "Right. And from the time you arrived in the room to now, have you heard me utter anything resembling an addition to that?" "No, sir," he served back. Excuse me. Getting a whiff at this polygraph was mostly a game of derision. No, I thought not," the king accepted, an unhinged smirk, signaling a troubling bonus round. "But why, then, has it been so Herculean for you to do as you're told?" Exploding from his seat, he reappeared and infringed on the officer's personal space, thereby dividing the throne room and cornering him with sordid threats. "You will instruct my men You will instruct my men to cancel this incursion. I want them at attention in those positions until I communicate otherwise. And if you or anyone else under your command steps a fraction of a hair out of line, or even so much as twitches a muscle out of place trying to be a hero, I will personally evict you from your privileges and comforts within Black Suit. Then, naked, but armed with what the Grey Ones sculpted between your legs, I'll send you to fight for my brother. Now, whether you die hoisting his banner or on the arduous walk to him will be no great loss to me. But which would you say has the better odds, Lieutenant? I'm sorry, your blackness. The knight capitulated, petrified of his genuality towards those ideas. I'll call for a ceasefire immediately. The trebuchets are positioned at the edge of the desert, and we've gathered every cavalry unit we can spare, along with your horse, as you requested, your excellency, a knight informed, handing Diamond a specially selected weapon. Much obliged, he replied, tying the sheath around his waist. As the knight escorted him outside, he took the opportunity to make covenant inquiry and settle the murmurings of the saddled army. Pardon my asking, sir, but how will you use all of these riders? Fully prepared to convert the explanation into a rousing speech for all the men lining up beside him, Diamond mounted his steed and amplified. Black Suit will be the first hurdle they'll encounter. They won't be able to hold them long, but the objective is to do as much damage as they can before they break. Ideally, that would mean that before the Jabberwock King reached us, a number of his beasts would be tired and bloodied. Those are what will charge straight through. At about this time is when Hart, who dressed herself in thick leather and light chainmail, joined the meeting of the ranks. Though she'd been late, she was aware of the proper moment to chime in with a question of her own. While handing her husband a golden satchel bearing contents undisclosed, she asked, "What will you do with me?" "Your regiment will act as our second volley," he replied, graciously taking the item and throwing its strap over his shoulder. "What we can't cut down, you will wear out. I'd wager their counter to this will be to push us into cover, to funnel us into the castle, but we can't allow them to trap us. We must stay moving. The more they chase, the weaker they'll get, and the larger our openings to strike will be. And when you get them, you hit them hard and fast. You hit them fast. And you hit them hard. I want them completely disheveled. I want direct access to him. Any other questions?" "Just one," she said in a more intimate octave. But if it just so happened to be overheard, no soldier would care. "Does it hurt?" "You won't feel a thing," he assured, leaning down to her. "There are no words, either in literature or spoken language, that can accurately define the type of love the couple inserted into their last kiss. The following scene put all the former king's men in a line, a base for their reverse L-shaped formation. As time ticked by, the weight affected their horses with a frenzied impatience. The mixture of aggressive whinnying with the stomping of hooves and wrestling with bridles briefly captivated Diamond. Whatever influenced this uncontrollable behavior, he sympathized with them. He himself focused on his appreciation for the sun. He felt grateful, on one hand, that his daughter went unstricken by the bad omen of rain and gloom on her momentous day, and on the other hand, he was just glad to see it, to thank it for being there in this, his fleeting hour. Squinting through its nuisance glare, Diamond tried to distinguish details about the roaring wall of teeth, wings, claws, and fire that was infesting the horizon. However, there was no sign of any wounded nor dying Jabberwockies, but he wasn't bothered. Less than 30 seconds later, he would be unleashing his remedy. A shrill whistle, like the screech of a falcon, was dispersed on the breeze until a response of equal pitch and duration echoed outward from beyond the castle. This was the warning before Wonderland's wooden monsters creaked to life. 4 or 5 trebuchet arms slung forward in rhythmic succession to launch the contents of their buckets from the edge of the desert, high over the heads of the men. It wasn't boulders they were throwing. No, boulders weren't good enough, weren't deadly enough. Diamond's brainchild was to commission his masons to gather the kingdom's loose building materials and stack them into solid segments, small enough to toss, but duly wide enough to devastate the Jabberwocky army with multiple casualties in a single load. The structures were designed to soar and bury themselves in the ground and touch off like a landmine, churning a drizzle of dirt and the blood of the drove it hit to rain down and varnish its trench. He couldn't help but smirk in arrogance as the sounds of death appeared to aggravate the horses deeper. He reared, apparently ready to lead the charge, with Diamond being the last to know. Wrapping the reins around his hand was a quick and really the only way of staying balanced in the saddle. There was no opportunity for lasting patriotic words before speeding away, just a primal scream as a battle cry. The fatiguing muscles of the Jabberwock King's wings relaxed, lowering him to grace the ground. He was trepidatious at first about the sensations he'd been neglected for years, but eased himself into them with the minor traces of familiarity from his memory. The sand caked the pads of his feet. The sand caking the pads of his feet was warm, and the grass that brushed and tickled them was likewise soft. Just as his counterpart had done, he noticed the sun, and as its rays soaked into his gray complexion, he felt welcomed home. Like a reaper stalking through a graveyard, he moved over the crushed and crippled, those lost to the tonnage of the bombing. Surveying the landscape, he had to admit that the desperate King Diamond's enterprising assault was admirable, but he scoffed at the egregious omission he made while his cavalry galloped on. His targets that outmaneuvered and survived the trebuchets were now out of range, too close to be fired at. Again, this meant that the artillery was either useless or would have to be repositioned depending on what they were commanded to do. And as they were withdrawn, the Jabberwock king was left holding all the ammunition. It began with subtle vibrations all around him. He had control now, and there was nary a question of what he was going to do with it. The reaction was finicky and oversensitive, so he kept the power increased deliberate and precise. By the time he raised a clenched fist to his lips, the structures were levitating, rotating, and situating. Not just one or two at a time, but every wall that had been fired, as well as every single piece of shrapnel they produced, thereby tripling or quadrupling the rate of fire set by Diamond's machines in an instant. Opening his palm brought down a clustered strike, fiendish yet reckless. Mounted knights or Jabberwockies, it didn't discriminate. It massacred. "Their line is failing. What do we do, madam?" a horrified soldier wondered, looking on from the vertical branch of the L-shape as riders randomly disappeared into waves of emitting turf. Hart, who had already read the situation analytically, saw what Diamond was realizing too late. They were betrayed, and her husband would die before using his crystal rose. If she wanted any hope of rescuing him, she needed to think on her feet, chart an untested anchor to break the unraveling events. "Archers to the front," she yelled, trotting her horse out of formation to the lead. "We will be a distraction. Do everything we can to snatch their attention. How are we supposed to pull them away without hitting our own men?" A second man voiced from somewhere amidst the reshuffling suits. "If you can't guarantee me that kind of accuracy, soldier, then I'd suggest you arm yourself with something dull and on a stick," she snapped, clucking to her steed. Adapting Diamond's original philosophy of weaken what we're unable to kill, she fractioned her regiment into pairs, one bodyguard to an archer, partially for protection and also as an accompanying blow to ensure that whatever the arrows maimed were properly disposed of. Leaping into the chaos head-on, Hart immediately claimed her first trophy via her horse. A juvenile Jabberwocky that lay paralyzed by a smattering of arrows along its hindquarters and spine was impotent against the hooves colliding with it, snapping its neck and concaving its skull. Compassion for the suffering wasn't a high priority for Hart. Adrenaline overflowed from there. Landing, a Bandersnatch jumped over her right shoulder and met the Jabberwocky in midair that she saw coming at her but wasn't in position to encounter. Lacerating the layers of its hide with its raptor claw and stabbing it repeatedly with its stinger, it quickly won the struggle. Simultaneously, on her left, Hart witnessed the tragedy of a team of knights who rode too close to one of the beasts. Where the archer ducked under this swinging whip-tail, their guard was strangled and flung off his horse. Another of her pets dispatched it by corkscrew tackling it to the ground by the throat. Submerging heart in the conflicting feelings of claustrophobia and comfort, 2 copper-tainted knights enclosed her, suggesting they wanted to be her escort to wherever she was trying to flee. Ahead, swooping Jabberwockies tried to frighten her horse and penetrate her trapezoidal cage. But steadfast as he was, he avoided them in such a way that they glanced off her and ricocheted straight into her newly acquisitioned entourage. The soldier riding to her left primed his tribald flail to clobber it in the crest as it passed. Excuse me. Losing altitude, it nosedived and skidded to a stop on the prairie. The man to her right swung their claymore, slicing a second across the breast, cleanly, and exiting with a stream of blood as the monster tumbled away. The matriarch of the royal family was able to exchange brief signals of thanks with her comrades before her heart shattered. A third Jabberwocky, undetected in the sky, released a knight fused at the legs to his mount from a dizzying height. It was the flail knight who unexpectedly broke their fall as they were dropped directly onto his horse's head. The weight on impact sent it into a somersault rotation, ejecting him from the saddle and ending his life. The abomination responsible for this wasn't finished there. Marking Hart as prey, it changed its path and lowered its flight to initiate the thrill of the chase. The lone claymore guard, who noticed it bounding after her, pulled back, sacrificing his safety to delay or kill it. Sadly, he accomplished nothing, as she turned around just in time to watch him narrowly miss being gored by its horns, but be unceremoniously knocked down and trampled. And then, as suddenly as she could return to her front-facing riding position, there was a flash that muted the noises surrounding her. She was deafened to the roars of foe over screams of friend. It all atrophied to silence when she was hurled through the air, and as gravity wrenched her down, she saw the slender black mass glide and snatch her horse out from under her. While in this, her quagmire, she determined that her destiny would repeat that of the flail knights, but instead of meeting hues of green and beige, she seemed to be caught by white, silky, and soft. A Bandersnatch had stolen her and whisked her away to whatever semblance of safety and protection it could offer. Its back was where Hart learned that the Jabberwockies had sandwiched her, were now fighting each other for ownership of her horse's lifeless and defiled carcass. She retched and quivered, watching them tear him into chunks, an abhorrent tug-of-war deciding the division of his entrails. Saliva and other juices from their meal moistened their maws as they swallowed their shares whole. She felt her companion adjusting its posture beneath her, the thump of his racing heart, and the tensing of his musculature between her thighs. He was ready to duel until yet another indiscernible flash appeared in his peripheral. Targeting the ribs, the fourth Jabberwocky rammed his side. The power behind it completely upended the pair, forcing the creature to roll over top of Hart, which momentarily immobilized and rendered her unconscious. Opposite her placement on the field, the Jabberwock King landed on the edge of the epicenter for the melee. The dust was thick, kicked up in dissipating billows by the moving pawns deadlocked in battle, meaning the visibility in front of him was poor, even with his advanced abilities. A slew of orders was punctuated by the adulterated colors of an inferno, producing a horse set aflame that startled as it charged past him. Less surprising was the band of brave foot soldiers that jumped through the pall after it. With fluent reaction and seamless combat, he dealt with each one as they came. Hitting the leader with a stiff fist, the blow turned the bones in his face to powder. From there, he utilized a short, twirling leap to drag both sets of claws across the next man's midsection, decapitating him where he stood. Ducking a sword, he countered by planting an elbow in the knight's spine, slightly bending him backward, making it easier to grab his neck and break it against the Dark One's trapezius. Before that man could fall to the ground, he had another, hooked by a single claw through the soft tissue of his chin, lifting him so his feet dangled and couldn't touch. He proceeded to use his free hand to remove the lower jaw from the rest of the skull, and before that soldier fell, he dodged a second weapon. This gave him control of the knight's arm and let him latch on from around and under the armpit. Almost playfully, the Jabberwock King dragged him into the air and recalled his grip like a ripcord, leaving his victim to spiral down in freefall. The knight landed on his chest and stomach, but that's not what killed him. He was impaled by his own sword when it was brought down and thrusted through him. The king enjoyed his squeals of pain for a moment, but granted mercy by putting the blade through the back of his head and out his mouth. Using the hilt as leverage, he threw himself up and hopped down, trapping the forehead of a fused cavalry unit in his palm in a modified clothesline. What vertebrae he didn't hear explode, he was sure the horse would finish when it folded and crushed him. Rising from a knee, he'd been spotted by a mounted figure emerging from the dust, fire, and corpses in the distance. The Jabberwock King killed 6 trained soldiers in a matter of seconds, but had a particular interest in what this one was going to do. Because this one wasn't just another fearful, clueless man on a horse trying to play hero and bring back a trophy in exchange for riches and the praise of his master. No, this was the master, the one he'd been waiting for. This was Diamond. He flicked his tongue and bared his fangs as Diamond barreled toward him. Planting his feet, he held his ground. Rather than acknowledge the rider or the sword, he went lower, focusing on the horse. With superior strength, he hoisted it on his shoulders, and fireman's carry slammed it onto its back, separating it from Diamond. It is remarkable how The kingdom remains unchanged, even decades on, he said, sauntering arrogantly, knowing his rival would be listening while he scrambled for a defense. I shudder to think that I'm the only thing in it that underwent any sort of metamorphosis. Oh, aside from you, of course, Diamond. Where a boy once stood, there is a man now in his place. Man enough to wield the sword that made your father famous, he wheezed, reminiscently, addressing the unemployed steel lying in the grass. I'd recognize that blade anywhere. How ironic, yet fitting, that it is here we be reunited, my old friend. Though I had hoped you'd bring the blade you've helped make famous at the expense of my children. His Vorpal blade. Where is it? It's safe, far from here, far from you, Diamond stammered, crawling to collect his weapon. When transitioned to a seated posture, he raised it to keep the threat at its point. If you do not possess the symbol of the kingship, then you have passed it on to your daughter, the Dark One hissed, visibly chuffed. Very good, so we can draw all of this to a close. I know you have it, Diamond. The crystal rose. What? But how? He panicked, laboring with the satchel strap around his shoulder and to shield the rest of it with his body. There are no secrets between kings, my lad, the Jabberwock king informed. Everything the gods whisper into your book, they scream into my ear. We both know how this must end. No, not like this, not so easily, he controverted. You're defying written law, the Black Lord choked in surprise, but also relished in the intrigue. No, Diamond elucidated, gaining the footing to support himself. I'm not sure when, but someday what's happened between you and I will be an oral tale spoken by one generation to the next. In it, I don't want to be seen as a coward who used this magic at the earliest convenience. I want the people to know I fought hard until my body could no longer, until my last breath, with honor. The Demon King yielded a bow, permitting Diamond to doff the golden satchel and ready himself for the requested contest. The mortal erupted off the start, choosing to pit his openly shown fury against the Jabberwock King's bottomless repertoire of illusions and tricks. Of course, this champion was easily punishable. Teleporting led to a reverse judo throw. One solid form was regained behind him. It spiked him into the dirt and left him sprawled, aligning him perfectly to suffer a stiff punt kick to the temple. With his methodical opponent looming over him, Diamond's breathing grew heavy, trying desperately to absorb his concussive abuse. But before he could, another kick, this one to the gut, popped him up from his jello-armed prone and turned him so he could be taken by the pelvis and power-bombed to the earth. The impact of landing high on his back and shoulders jarred loose the security over his weapon, but thankfully, though it was a strain, outstretched fingertips were able to contact the hilt just before the two were pulled apart. In fact, he could barely lift it, barely cup it in his fist before feeling the claws seize his ankle and pitch him about in a giant swing. All that was needed were 2 rotations. The first was dedicated to building speed, while the second was purely damage, as the back of his head and facial regions skipped across the ground like a rock on the surface of water. Somewhere in the back of his addled mind, Diamond nagged himself to get up and keep moving. Looking up from where he and the amalgamation of loose rock and grass had settled, he laid his eyes on his sword. It sat there, soaking in the glory of the sun, but miraculously it was still within reach. It was a risk, but a bigger one would be fighting hand to hand. He knew the Beast King was coming. He needed to make a decision, and fast. On his feet, he climbed, running before he even fully stood, and scrambling for traction. He didn't look back. He didn't have to in order to see the shadow of the horned lord devouring the light of the sky. Those wings of his accelerated him inhumanly, and a few strides into his sprint, Diamond felt a hand sweeping him at the knees. Falling backward, he blinked. He saw the Jabberwock King coming at him again to plant the point of his elbow just above his eyebrow, cutting him open. Then he sidestepped, so that when Diamond flipped almost completely around, he could post him on his shoulder and modify the actions into a running power slam. From the flat of his back, Diamond got the sense he was being intently studied. It was the Unholy One circling him, noting the extent of the injuries caused by his discipline. Though he was gagging for air, he was still breathing, and though he had yet to move extensively, it was obvious that he wasn't surrendering. So, to judge what Diamond would do next, he drifted to the sword. He tried to recoup and kicked it over. It took a handful of attempted pawings for Diamond's digits to find it, but soon the inverted blade functioned as much-needed support, a tool to assist in getting his ailing body up to reset and continue. This round consisted of an evenly matched trade of punches, kicks, dodges, and parries. It went on like that until a vicious European uppercut tagged Diamond on the chin, knocking him off balance. He recovered well, using his momentum to roll to his feet, but was wiped out by his adversary's rapid capitalization. A Uranagi slam awaited to put him down, where claws were readjusted to clamp around his throat, telegraphing a chokeslam. When that didn't suffice, the other was pressed against his windpipe, adding to the probability of something more ruinous. Diamond suspected this, playing possum whilst provoking this precise move. When the time was right, he kicked his nemesis in the knee, dropping him to a more controllable level. He wrapped himself around an arm and cinched the hold, straightening it and limiting his mobility. Learning he was now trapped, the Jabberwock King resisted with the part of himself that was free, his head. Unfortunately, he lost the leverage battle when Diamond grabbed a hold of a horn and wrenched his neck. When his head cranked to the side, he could do nothing to thwart the thrust of the blade that pierced his cheek. The edge jetted through the wall of his mouth, and utter bewilderment and horror were reflected in his crimson wormholes. Acting on impulse, he tore away from Diamond, and the lesion enlarged as the blade traveled to his jawbone. In fright, he recoiled and tried to disguise the wound, but there was no hiding this disfiguration. He took his hand away, feeling the unnatural warmth brought on by blood. His blood. Anger, unbridled rage boiled within him. Expelling it, he about-faced and booted a rallying Diamond out of the air. A thunderous drop kick shot him halfway across the field, where the malignant ruler teleported and flowed behind him, locking wrists around his waist. A profusion of German suplexes threw him down spitefully. Diamond silently tallied each one, spending all efforts during the maiden dozen on trying to break the iron clasp. The wings increased the power of the succeeding 13 or so, weakening him and reducing him to an incoherent ragdoll upon his merciful release. Well, folks, I guess there's a first time for everything, because I'm realizing that we're rapidly running out of time, and we're still in the middle of this chapter. So I think what we're going to do is stop right there and actually pick up the second half of this chapter in another episode that will release later this week. Not really too excited about that, because I like to, complete a chapter per episode. But, these things happen, and this is a very, very large chapter, as you can tell, with lots of things happening. So we're going to have to do what we have to do here. So we will continue this in the next episode, and I hope you guys will come and enjoy it. We'll see you later.